Indian polity. Indian Councils Act of 1861. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was an important legislation passed by the British Parliament during the colonial rule of India. It was a significant step in the evolution of representative institutions in British India. Here are some key points about the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Introduction of legislative councils. The Act introduced legislative councils at the central and provincial levels. The Central Council was called the Imperial Legislative Council, while the provincial councils were known as Provincial Legislative Councils. Composition of legislative councils. The Imperial Legislative Council consisted of members who were both elected and nominated. The majority of the members were nominated by the Governor-General. The provincial legislative councils had a similar composition with a mix of elected and nominated members, but the number of elected members was relatively small. Limited electorate. The right to vote and hold office in the legislative councils was restricted to a small portion of the population. Only a few wealthy and influential individuals, mainly representing the British community and Indian nobility, were eligible to participate in the electoral process. Limited legislative powers. The Act granted limited legislative powers to the legislative councils. The members could discuss and debate proposed laws but had no authority to introduce bills on their own. The final decision-making power remained with the Governor-General or the provincial governors. Advisory role. The Act primarily aimed to establish an advisory and consultative role for the legislative councils. The members could provide suggestions and recommendations to the Governor-General or the provincial governors on various legislative and administrative matters. Expansion of executive councils. The Act also expanded the executive councils at the central and provincial levels. The number of members in the executive councils increased, and some Indians were appointed as non-official members in the provincial executive councils. Separation of legislative and executive functions. The Act introduced a separation of legislative and executive functions. Members of the legislative councils were not necessarily members of the executive councils, and vice versa. Limited representation. The Act did not provide for direct representation of the Indian public in the legislative councils. The elected members mainly represented the interests of specific communities or groups rather than the broader population. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was seen as a modest step towards representative institutions in India. However, it fell short of fulfilling the aspirations of Indians for greater participation in governance. Subsequent reforms, such as the Indian Councils Act of 1892 and the Indian Councils Act of 1909, brought further changes and expansions to the legislative councils, leading eventually to the Government of India Act of 1919, which introduced a more substantial measure of representative government. Thank you.